Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Waldemar Skrobacki, and this is how I used to introduce myself to my University of Toronto students for many years. Well, this is recorded in a building that belongs to Jagiellonian University, so let me reintroduce myself. My name is Waldemar Skrobacki. I am new here in this very old and prestigious university. And the theme of old and new will be the main theme of this little talk, brief as it can be, about Europe and all the changes that have been happening for the last several decades. That is the new in the old. Well, and all things in Europe are old. Last year, this university celebrated its 658th birthday. Kraków, in which Jagiellonian is located, is one of the oldest, not to mention one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. The history of Poland, the written history, is longer than 8,000 years. And Europe is very often referred to as the old continent. It's practically a synonym, Europe or old continent. But ladies and gentlemen, old it may be, if you count the years and the history, but it is also new, because Europe, all parts of Europe, including the parts we are in, have been going for the last several decades through some fundamental changes, to the point that very often, as you will see during this talk, the old doesn't really fit anymore. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with the old and the new. My old way of pronouncing my name and my old way of pronouncing my name, that's just a good beginning. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with the old Europe without any addition to it, not old and new, but just old. And the old Europe had a, I guess, unusual characteristic. It had a split personality. Well, personality number one, it was the Europeans who have for centuries and centuries written books about all the good things, such as democracy, parliamentarism, constitutionalism, political rights. And when they were done writing those books and left their offices, the reality of Europe was the opposite of what they were writing about. That's personality number two. Europe was an unstable continent. Between the 16th century and the 20th century, and there are people who actually counted that, Europe had more than 6,000 various types of conflicts, wars. Some of them were shorter, some of them were longer. One war lasted more than a century, but wars they were, and they came with all the things that wars usually come from: instability, bloodshed, and, well, barbarism. Most of the wars that Europe had were driven by nationalism. And with nationalism in the old Europe came hatred. So the French just couldn't stand the Germans and vice versa. So the two went to wars, many of them again and again. And it's not an exception. There was the hatred between the Poles and the Germans, the Portuguese and the Spanish, and so on and so forth. This made this little, small, and very populous continent, well, just prone to conflicts, and that's how it was. And then Europe had those two huge wars, the first and the second. They were so huge and had such impact on the world that they are called world wars, the first and the second. And towards the end of the Second World War, Europe, the Europeans, and people who were the political leaders at that time had a choice. The choice was keep on going and most likely have another war, a third one, which would have been fought most likely with nukes because the Europeans were about to get those. Or it was the second choice: change the continent and change the continent fundamentally. First of all, make it stable. So, out of necessity and probably out of wisdom, they decided to go for the second option: Europe with no wars, a stable continent. That meant, first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, to remove the split personalities and go with the intellectual history of Europe. Democracy, constitutionalism, and all of that, but do it. Not just write about it, think about it, but do it in reality. Well, that was a tall task, wasn't it? Because stopping wars really meant changing the way the Europeans thought, conceived, comprehended politics, the role of government, the role of interests played in politics, and that had to be a revolution not only in, say, institutional form, but also a revolution in the Europeans' heads. And that was the toughest part, the most difficult part, because having so many wars for so long eventually created a situation when the Europeans started to actually rationalize war, turn it into a rational decision. And one of those who is probably most famous for rationalizing war as a way of life was Karl von Clausewitz, a German military man and a strategist who in his book on war was arguing precisely that wars is simply a means to an end. It is, and this is the most famous quote from his book, war is the continuation of politics by other means. That means simply that. If I cannot compel you to do things I want you to do with words, for instance using diplomacy, that it is perfectly fine and absolutely rational to do it with bullets. One way or another, it's still about achieving the end. And war is just a means to it.